Hello, Imacuttlefish aka Baker here, and welcome to another character analysis from the Endwalker main cast. This time, we will be covering the spunky and sassy Alisaie Levelier, certainly the more explosive Levelier twin. In the Alphino video, I didn't talk about the relationship between him and Alisaie, and the reason is because I think it's much more fitting to do so here, because now that I already talked about Alphino, we can then contrast him to Alisaie and inspect how they turned Alisaie from being basically second Alphino into an amazing character on her own, and how brilliantly they captured that twin magic they have going on, where they are simultaneously very similar and different to each other, which I will be doing throughout this video. As a side note, I also mentioned in that video that I would talk about Ameliance in this one, but since it's confirmed there will be more of her in the future as a custom delivery NPC, and maybe she might appear in other quest lines, it might almost be better to just talk about her individually or as part of the eventual Endwalker analysis. Right, so when talking about Alisaie, I do want to cover the backdrop for her character prior to her introduction in 3.4, because much of it is behind an optional storyline and a side story, meaning some of you have either not experienced them at all, or they were so long ago you may have forgotten some details at this point, so enjoy this reading. Just like her twin brother, Alisaie too inherited some notable qualities from Louisoix growing up, such as his rebellious spirit. Just as was the case with Alphino, she would often clash with her peers and earn the scorn of those around her, though in Alisaie's case it was due to her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude. And like Alphino, she was successful in school, even though she always felt like she was in his shadow, his accomplishments outweighing hers. She left Charlian as she shared the same drive as Alphino in wanting to figure out why their grandfather left their great country for this dump called Eorzea and gave his everything, even paid the ultimate sacrifice to save it. In contrast to her brother, Alisaie had a tough time trying to wrap her head around it. She became rather infuriated when she discovered the sorry state that the realm was in, when she saw the pettiness that went on between nations, people seemingly rewriting history as they please, not honoring the heroes that saved them, and so on. Her issues, though similar to Alphino's, manifested in different ways. She allowed herself to buy into this hype that Eorzea must be some amazing, super incredible wonderland, because why else would their grandfather have abandoned everyone, even his own family, herself included, for its sake? And when it doesn't match up to her lofty standards, she throws a hissy fit. So yeah, she was pretty much disappointed by the bickering between the city-states, and she failed to see why Louisoix was so invested in the fate of Eorzea and its people. She then rage quits and went to investigate what happened to Louisoix and Bahamut on that fateful day 5 years ago, hoping that in the process she would come to understand why Louisoix left, a process that took her far longer than her brother. Now, I will repeat certain bits I said in the Bahamut video, and I will have to ask those who've seen it to bear with me here. And I would also implore you go check the video out if you're interested in hearing the whole thing, because I will try to TLDR as much as I can here. In second coil, Alisaie is shocked to find out that Louisoix has become Bahamut's thrall. This becomes crystal clear when he warns the warrior of light and Alisaie to not meddle with Bahamut's regeneration. This only really serves to strengthen her resolve, as she cannot tolerate her grandfather's legacy being ruined. In final coil, Alphino forces himself into the expedition. He confronts Alisaie about her lack of a true motivation, only the vague notion she adopted from Louisoix of protecting Eorzea. He insists that she should have her own reason to fight instead of piggybacking off of her grandfather's motivations in life. But both of them realize that stopping Bahamut is more acute, so they stop bickering and enter the final coil of Bahamut. Inside, the twins are both shocked and disgusted at the realization of how Dalamud really operates due to all the suffering caused by Alag. Then the twins finally come face to face with the enthralled Louisoix. He speaks from the point of view of the primal Bahamut, condemning all of mankind and proclaiming there is no peace for dragonkind until all of humanity is erased, even using the twins' inability to understand one another as an example. Alphinaud then takes a gamble and, under the assumption that Louisoix may have become a primal thanks to the desperate prayers of people during Cardinal and an abundant source of ether, calls him out on it, and he hit the nail on the head as Louisoix reveals himself to be the primal phoenix. The warrior flight is forced to fight Louisoix, the Scion's former mentor, the twins' grandfather, as well as Eorzea's savior and legendary icon. With Bahamut's overwhelming presence in the background and a melancholic atmosphere, a speechless fight is fought where neither side wants to truly harm the other, as the warrior flight has to fight back against the phoenix's fabled ability of immortality. After a painful encounter, however, the warrior flight is able to strike a decisive blow and free Louisoix from his torment. Louisoix disables the second regenerating device and grants you access to the final interment Hulk, the Burning Heart. He has one final touching moment with the twins, and as his final act, teaches them how to summon Phoenix. He then dies off. Once the warrior flight defeats Bahamut Prime, Alisaie is able to fully disable Bahamut's regeneration systems, and the primal is gone for good, thus drawing the 7th Umbral Era to its conclusion. With the future of Eorzea now secured, the twins have to make an important decision, and they decide that they and the warrior flight should be the final witnesses to the truth behind the calamity, since if people learned of the existence of Phoenix, they would come to pray to this deity to undo the suffering caused by the calamity, thus undoing all of their grandfather's work. Alisaie grows a lot from the experience, being less dependent on her brother, and after some nudging from both Alphinaud and by Louisoix, as well as being faced with death by Bahamut, she finally finds a deep fiery resolve within her to wanna find her own reason to fight for this realm, one that she herself would come to, instead of simply following in her grandfather's footsteps and trying to imitate him. At the end of the storyline, Alisaie chooses to honor the memory of her grandfather, as well as Nail and the Meracidian dragons, as that is the best she can do for them for now. Having grown from the experience, Alisaie promises the warrior flight that she would try to do some adventuring of her own, to go on a journey to try and find her passion, her own reason to fight for the realm. Alisaie accomplishes two things that Alphinaud also accomplished throughout A Realm Reborn and Heavensward. She was able to dispel her own disillusionment surrounding Louisoix, and she was able to come to appreciate the warrior flight as a person, instead of as a tool. At the beginning of the storyline, she very bluntly tells the warrior flight that they recruited them only because they slew Van Baelsar, and she could use someone with their combat power. But by the end of the storyline, she has grown rather attached to the warrior flight for their unfaltering courage in freeing Louisoix and in fighting back against Bahamut's infernal wrath, but also how selflessly they are willing to accept being the final witness, of no one getting to find out about their incredible deeds, acts of heroism, and being the savior of the realm by ending Bahamut. It is something that she admits that even the very thought and injustice of it is nearly too much for her to bear. This is basically where she got her deep admiration for the warrior flight, or the beginnings of it at least. Obviously your countless deeds would only feed the fangirl inside her further, but it's important to note that this was really the thing that earned you her respect. The next segment is from Tales of the Dragon Song War side story number 7, which describes this journey. After the events of Final Coil, she went to travel in places alone, because she thinks that traveling with another, whether that be an adventurer, a servant, or, God forbid, her brother, would mean she wouldn't get her own impressions of things. So she comes across this peddler called Emery. A nomadic merchant's lifestyle seemed appealing to her, and though she tried to play a hard ass, since someone of her learning shouldn't appear as someone interested in such things, she does kind of a poor job at it, and she ends up joining Emery as a guard, replacing the previous one who was trying to extort her. She learned a lot of things on this short journey of hers. She came to appreciate the more mundane professions in the world, experiencing firsthand how rough it was to be a caravan guard. This is brilliant because it pretty much mirrors Alphinaud's journey on the road with Estinian. One day, instead of having Alisaie be just a guard, Emery coaxes her into selling the products. Alisaie is of course very hesitant, even panicking a little, believing this is a job that her brother would be able to do. However, she ends up performing quite admirably even with all the haggling that went on that day. Perhaps it was because she didn't want to be outdone by her brother, or just the pressure of the situation, but what we see here is that she was able to do something that she believed only her brother to be good at, without much issue I might add. I will come to this point much later, but what it shows us is that it's baby steps towards not needing to rely on her brother anymore. Alisaie grows rather fond of Emery because she's someone who appreciates her simply as a friend, not as the famous grandchild of Luisua. She also teaches her to not be so hard on herself. When Alisaie goes into her nightly routine of studying, she takes the book off of her hands and slams it shut, imploring that she be happy enough with her accomplishments of that day, of making her first major sale. This was probably a valuable lesson for Alisaie in her path to self-discovery, seeing as the only reason she had this habit in the first place was because she was following her grandfather's example, so it probably made her think, okay, maybe I don't have to follow it to the letter and I can afford to chill sometimes. One day, they were riding a caravan when Emery got crushed by a bunch of rocks falling during a bad weather. Yep, she dies, just like that. Alisaie was chilling at the front, completely unharmed because the rocks fell on everything at the back. Needless to say, that was quite the shock to her. Hell, it was a shock to me reading the story. And who can blame her? This was the first true friend she had made. Someone not looking up to her or someone that she looks up to, but someone she could simply call a friend, a companion. Again, mirroring Alphinaud, this was essentially what Arenwald was to him. It's honestly pretty messed up. Her death comes across as quite tragic. So Alisaie pretty much went back to traveling alone, distancing herself from others because the thought of trying to befriend someone else was too painful for her in this moment. It was during this lonely time of her life that she came across these rumors of some group of heroes that were supposedly doing the work of the Scions, but weren't actually Scions themselves. This led to her investigating the Warriors of Darkness. She was determined to learn the true nature of these champions whose fates appeared to have been intertwined with Alphinaud and his comrades, but she was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of her life, which was thinking she could do this alone. She gets caught, of course, and gets easily taken out by the archer of the group. Unbeknownst to her, she wasn't the only one tailing these fellows, for Tancred was shadowing them as well, much more successfully of course. She was very lucky for that, and Tancred was barely able to get her to Ishgard to safety. She was even more lucky that the best chirurgeons in the entire nation looked after her and were able to keep her alive. And that's where we get to our first introduction to Alisaie in Heavensward in 3.4. What we basically have here is a mirror of Alphinaud's story, just way more condensed and mostly in optional content. Alphinaud was arrogant in how he thought he was in a position to command others when he really wasn't, and relied way too much on other people to wipe his ass and do everything for him. He then paid the price for it, got humbled, and changed his attitude. Alisaie's case here is almost identical, just in sort of reverse. After relying too much on the warrior flight and his brother in Coils, and through her loss of her friend, she became arrogant and thought she didn't need to rely on anyone else, that she could do this alone.
No, I don't, you're right. It's pure arrogance to imagine I can solve everything by myself. You'd think I'd have learned that by now. Thank you.
She then very nearly died for it, which for her was a shocking life-changing experience, and she joins the Scions. Not just because it allows her an opportunity to discover herself, but also because she realizes her earlier view of not wanting to be with people so as to limit the amount of impressions she has is quite silly, because it is in fact through observing different walks of life and different perspectives in how you truly come to grow. Again, similar to Alphinaud's journey. But she also joins the Scions because she realizes she can't fight alone. She needs these people, but she doesn't want to rely on them like she had to rely on them before. She wants to fight with them as equals. We see that just like Alphinaud, Alisaie too has been through a lot. I think that's awesome. Now, I know what y'all gonna say. Literally everything I have been describing here is from optional content, and I am even really getting into it, reading a lot into her story. Yes, she is for all intents and purposes a wholly optional character until patch 3.4. If you didn't do Coils and didn't read her side story, then you pretty much have no idea what she was up to between very early A Realm Reborn until 3.4, which, mind you, is a time gap spanning multiple years if you did this stuff on content. But I am gonna give you a spicy take and say this is actually a good thing, and that I think it was done this way deliberately. Yeah, really. See, this whole journey that I'm describing of Alisaie, it's pretty much a repeat of Alphinaud's journey of self-discovery. Sure, it's flavored differently and has some subtle differences, but by and large it's the same thing. It's her coming to terms with the legacy of her grandfather, her being an arrogant brat, learning to appreciate the warrior of light, being humbled, and joining the Scions not as a douche, but as an equal. Thus, I think putting it in side content, and especially with the bit in 3.4, making it extremely brief, put the writers in a better position, as she already had went through a similar conflict as the one that Alphinaud went through. It would have been tedious to simply see the same thing play out again, if you get what I mean. Instead, now they get to focus, right off the bat, on what makes Alisaie, Alisaie, and not another Alphinaud in quotations. And that's indeed something they start developing basically right away as she gets introduced in 3.4. So now that we have the setup out of the way, let's talk a bit about Alisaie and how they turned her into her being her own character. First, we have the obvious stuff.
As Eorzea's blade of light once stood by my side, now I shall stand at hers and defend this realm with all my might.
She ditches the book she had in Coils and reveals this cool etheric blade. She was also the first time they teased an upcoming job with a character. Well, if you don't count Tancred, who was a bit technical. This instantly tells us that she is much more offensive oriented as contrasted to Alphinaud, who is a healer, ergo supportive in nature. She has her own distinct personality quirks, like how she's much more sassy than Alphinaud, and is much more upfront in throwing dirt at her brother, much like Cryo, though she still very much loves him and shares a special connection to him, something that can only exist between brother and sister.
I can swim well enough. How about you, Alisaie?
Oh, like a fish, in contrast to my doggy-paddling brother. Somehow, the boy just isn't very buoyant.
She's got her unique set of skills, excelling in more mundane things over her brother, such as swimming, which goes back to that side story I talked about, of her learning to be more appreciative of mundane aspects of life. Though in Endwalker it's revealed that this had been the case since they were children, but my point stands. In the storyline with Gabu, Alisaie is shown to be someone much more forthcoming with their emotions. If you consider the twins, she's basically the heart as opposed to Alphinaud being the brain. Though there is more to this and I'll talk all about that later. These are things that are immediately introduced to us and it's awesome. But they don't stop there. Whereas Alphinaud got his journey in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, we see Alisaie get a lot of attention in Stormblood. In late Heavensward and throughout Stormblood, she grows her mindset of leaping into action basically being much more impulsive in contrast to her brother, but she wasn't like this from the get-go. Rather, it's something that grew on her through her experience of going through the 4.0 story, similar as some of those good qualities I talked about with Alphinaud. Initially, she shows restraint at the behest of other people, such as when Alphinaud implores her to stand back while Gabu summons Titan in 3.4. Things then escalate, Titan gets summoned, the warrior flight has to deal with the situation, and Gabu is tempered by Titan, which ends up being a rather traumatic experience for her. We'll talk about Gabu more in a bit here. And then in 4.0, she, Gosetsu, Lise, and the warrior flight bear witness to Yotsuyu murdering some Doman citizens. When she tries to take the careful approach, citing that they should be looking at it from a wider picture, Gosetsu uses an Yuno reverse card and calls her out as the one being blind, stating that the people are already suffering, and even though his action might seem reckless, he wants to act right now because he cares for these people and wants to end the madness Yotsuyu is putting up. So let's examine these two instances. We have an instance where she held back at her brother's request and it didn't work. Then we have an instance where she wanted to exercise restraint, yet taking a direct approach right then and there ended up being the solution. What this tells Alisaie is that it seems that a reserved approach just doesn't seem to be it. Similar to Alphinaud's journey of soul-searching, she too is able to observe situations and grow from them, and we see this just prior to us fighting Lakshmi. See, when a similar situation is presented to her a third time, when the Ananta summon Lakshmi, she doesn't go with the reserved approach and instead chooses to be impulsive and jump into action. Because she is seeing so much wrong with the situation, she sees the grief the mother is having over her dead daughter and how the primal is tainting the mother's image of her, promising salvation and bliss, which in reality is utter bullcrap. She gets so pissed off over the situation, and because she genuinely cares for the mother and her suffering, she decides then and there to take a stand. She's had enough of sitting on her ass and letting things happen while she does nothing. Emotionally charged, she jumps in and gives her peace.
Now do you see her promises for what they are?
Alisaie, have you gone mad?
Mayhap I have, but I refuse to stand by and watch yet another tragedy unfold. No! We come not to shed blood, but to save you from the false god who would lead you astray. I understand how you feel. I do. You loved her with all your heart, but when the moment came, you still couldn't save her. The anguish, the anger, I know it only too well. But I also know where this path leads. To embrace a primal is to condemn yourself to an endless cycle of despair. You will never know peace. You tempt them with visions of things that can never be and leave them bereft and wanting. No illusion, however sweet, can change the fact that your daughter is gone. Remember her as she was. Do not suffer this piteous shade to tarnish her memory.
Same as with some of Alphinaud's actions that I discussed. Is this rational? Of course not. She even acknowledges as much after the fact. But both Alisaie and the audience comes to realize maybe this is the type of a person Alisaie truly is, and that she should embrace it. And this is honestly a pretty big moment that really defines Alisaie as a character, and is the first major event that shows she is more than just the other Alphinaud. What I mean is that she tried to emulate her brother's behavior of showing restraint, and it hadn't worked out for her, so she does what Alisaie would do, and in that moment allows herself to be simply herself. In that sense, her learning to be more impulsive is not a trait she specifically learned through this experience. I think her inclination to take action over inaction was always there. It's more that this is where she realizes that she shouldn't suppress those feelings and instead do what she thinks is right, even if it might seem irrational to most people around her. Because you can only be you. Man, I really like this message they're giving us here. Because normally when you got this kind of a thing set up, it's often done in a way where a character is acting rash and through their emotion is seen as a bad thing. And it's something that the character has to overcome. Basically, learn to be more chill, to be able to sit back, keep their emotions in check, and think logically instead of rushing in. I love the fact that they did the literal opposite of this with Alisaie. Her quickness to leap into action and act a little rash is painted in a positive way, because Alphinaud himself provides a nice counterbalance to it. It also shows us how inaction can oftentimes be a really bad thing, and that sometimes it's best to just do what you feel is right in that situation and go for it, instead of sitting on your ass doing nothing. You know that whole Churchill quote, "I never worry about action, but only about inaction." But more than that, I rather enjoy the fact that her love for others, her emotions, her heart is not shown as a weakness but as a strength. Yeah, awesome. And we see more and more of this side of Alisaie throughout the rest of the story. So yeah, it's very much a recurring feature of her character, but I just wanted to point out that this is where it all began to really take off. And this is indeed something that defines Alisaie's role in the story. Alisaie falls into the upbeat character archetype that is prevalent throughout the FF series, such as Prompto, Vanille, Tidus, and Selphie, just to mention a few, even if she might not be as extreme as some of the other characters mentioned, but proportionally speaking to the other characters from the main cast, she has a much more cheery nature. Though it's worth noting that as far as the Heidelin/Zodiac story is concerned, this role was originally taken by Ida/Lise, but Alisaie was slowly pushed into this position during Stormblood, since obviously Lise was eventually going to be phased out of the story. Alisaie's success is actually quite interesting to me. She's a rather spunky and upbeat character, as well as easily the most emotionally driven character from the story, yet a very well received character. And why it's interesting is because in the past, when looking at the aforementioned characters, they were often a bit divisive, some seeing them as simply irritating. Tidus is an especially interesting comparison, seeing as he too was this rather upbeat character that was emotional a lot of the time, as well as being a major character in that story. I definitely remember when FF10 was fresh, Tidus earning this reputation among a certain part of the fanbase as being this whiny and annoying character. This is in complete contrast to Alisaie, who is often praised despite being of the same archetype as Tidus and the others. It makes me wonder if this difference in perception comes from Alisaie simply being a better written character and having more depth to her, or if it's more to do with the general Final Fantasy fanbase making a shift from enjoying the more broody, serious characters to coming to appreciate the more upbeat ones. Or, it could be both. I'm nevertheless glad for the appreciation behind Alisaie, because these kinds of characters, though they may appear annoying to some, are nonetheless an important component in this type of a story when you consider how dark the story of FF14 actually is. You need to sprinkle in moments of levity to counterbalance the pathos. But an upbeat character like Alisaie can also be used to do very much the opposite. A good example is at the start of Shadowbringers. Many players remember this as quite the depressing segment and something that helps sell it, with the Amareng segment and the subsequent Homeminster Suite section is the almost complete absence of Alisaie's cheeriness. Or the Garlemald segment in Endwalker, to use another example. So in a sense you could say that Alisaie is really the heart of the story. Whenever she's absent or gloomy, it also reflects on the overall tone of the story, because we are so used to seeing her optimistic nature. Of course, Stormblood also starts setting up Alisaie as a very important character, and just as I alluded to in my Alphinaud video, she could also be seen as the deuteragonist in the Heidelin/Zodiac story, either in place of or alongside Alphinaud, because as I pointed out then, you can have multiple deuteragonists, Harry Potter and Shadowbringers both being good examples of such stories. So it depends on your interpretation, but regardless, it was here in Stormblood where she was getting pushed to the forefront. One more thing I want to mention in regards to Stormblood is that they actually foreshadow her opposition to Grahatia wanting to sacrifice himself all the way back in 4.0. After she has that badass scene of fighting the Red Kojin, Lise is really worried about leaving her behind, and there's this kind of a fake drama setup, only to have her appear out of the water with this line: "I said I was going to distract them, not make a heroic and ultimately futile last stand." Who does that anyway? This line is obviously just some gallows humor, something that Alisaie likes to oppress from time to time, but you have probably heard the saying that there is some truth in every joke.
Hold out for as long as you can, but remember, noble sacrifices are to remain an absolute last resort.
This is me really reading into this, but I believe that she developed this mindset of being against heroic sacrifices as a reaction to her grandfather's death. As in, Luisua's sacrifice for the realm shocked her so much, she developed this innate resistance to any attempts at making sacrifices, unless it's 101% absolutely required. I like that it's being set up here because it then has a natural follow-up in Shadowbringers, where she is by far the most vocal in opposing Grahatia's sack strat to save the Scions. This makes for an interesting contrast to Urianger, who very much accepts that these sorts of sacrifices are a part of life and mandatory. In this sense, one could argue that Alisaie's mindset about being anti-sacrifice is something of a childish mentality, and I think that is very much the case. But similar as with Alphinaud, these certain quote-unquote immature traits of the twins are what make them so endearing, because a normal person would react to Grahatia wanting to sacrifice himself and say, "Yeah, sure, let's go with that. I mean, the guy himself wants it, so why not, right?" But by going along with that, you are taking the easy way out. That's why I find Alisaie's resolve to keep Grahatia alive admirable, even if a more mature and a humble person would accept that Graha's suggestion is the only way. And if you recall, that's exactly what Urianger thought and why he went along with it. And indeed, how many people in Urianger's position would have actually opposed the plan? Of course, FF14 takes a rather interesting stance on these sorts of personal sacrifices, but I think I would really derail the video if I went in more detail, so perhaps another time. Something to also keep in mind is that even though Alisaie tends to be more fond of action and is more direct than her brother, whom Alisaie herself admits might be more clever than her, Alisaie is not stupid. She has quite a lot of wit, actually, and this isn't known to us just because of the backstory that said so. We see this displayed throughout the game. She demonstrates good ability to read people, like when she immediately catches on to Urianger's BS based on how he normally speaks in 3.4, or how she knows what makes the Confederacy tick in early 4.0.
If we succeed, you help us liberate Asari. If we fail, you lose nothing. A simple enough wager, if you have the stones for it.
She is being strategic on multiple occasions, such as making the decision to have her and the others hang back when the Warrior Flight and Yugiri went to assassinate Xenos, knowing that Lise would rush in the moment she saw him.
I'm sorry we couldn't be there. Alisaie made me swear to stay behind no matter what. I think she was worried I'd hurl myself at Xenos the moment I set eyes on him.
What?
Her aptitude for diplomacy, though not as good as her brother, is still quite decent as shown in 4.5. She diligently studies and is quick to learn new combat forms, demonstrated in her side story as well as in the Red Mage questline. We can see Alisaie's forward-thinking nature, especially in Shadowbringers, when in the first, she wastes no time in studying their foe, the Sin Eaters, and learns a lot about them, as she is rather astute in noticing how someone's etheric harmony is affected by the light. This then culminates in her playing an integral role in finding a cure for the tempering, which is pretty much the equivalent of curing cancer, something that we saw fix many of the world's problems almost right off the bat. I mean, duh. And many more such instances. I guess this is kinda obvious, but I just want to bring it up because Alisaie makes for a refreshing change from the usual hot-headed emotional character archetype, in that we have someone who has those traits but is actually intelligent, i.e., You can be hot-headed without having to also be brain-dead.
I think in terms of favourite scenes, I mean, Colin would be cross if I said it wasn't to do with Alphino. So it's definitely Alphino, but it actually is because I love their scenes. I love their scenes. I love how real the bickering is. I love how much people feel it. Like, I get so many messages from people saying, you're just like me and my brother, or you're just like me and my twin. And I have a sister, and we bickered, so I know what it's like. I know what it's like to love someone so much and yet find them so infuriating. It's very normal, isn't it, as humans to feel that. But the love between them, like my sister and I were incredibly close, and we still are. And I think with Alphino and Alisaie, that love between them, we're only just starting to see that now.
Let us now discuss the twins more in detail. I talked about how Alphino being a bit goofy at times is reflective of him being a kid, despite all the experience he has. Well, Alisaie is very much the same, especially her blatant admiration for the warrior of light being something that is often played for laughs and something really relatable. But this also applies for when we look at it a bit deeper. Alphino's extreme form of altruism could be seen as a childish quality, but it is nevertheless a good quality of his character, as we come to find out and develop, especially in Shadowbringers. And so it is with Alisaie. Her being that emotional and her directness can be seen as something of a childish feature, and she does sometimes end up in a childish light, especially when Y'shtola is trolling her, but it's still very much good quality that exists within her. Compassion is another thing where Alphino and Alisaie show two sides of the same coin. Alphino and Alisaie both do things that may seem irrational to some, born out of their compassion. It just manifests in a different way according to their personality. Alphino is altruistic, almost to a fault. He would look at a person who has done something wrong or questionable, even if it's done to him personally, and truly believes that the person might just have been swept up by an unfortunate circumstance and that they can do better. Thus, he gives them a second chance. Because he truly believes the best in others, it is this desire, this belief that people can always do better that drives him into acts of compassion. Throughout the story, this leads him into making decisions that might seem irrational to most of us. Sometimes he is rewarded for it, and at other times it backfires. To phrase this in another way, you could say that Alphino gravitates more towards showing compassion to people who have done wrong. Meanwhile, Alisaie is more predisposed to give that compassion to people that she sees more or less as innocent. She sees the cruelty in the situation and wants to address it right away, causing her to jump to action. In addition to this, she feels a lot for people who are extremely downtrodden, whereas most people in the FF14 world don't really care for the beast tribes, and indeed a good portion of the Eorzean population are actively racist against them. She treats them like another human being and shows a lot of empathy for them. Especially when it comes to temperate individuals. Everyone considers them dead, but Alisaie chooses to believe that Gabu was still alive in some shape or fashion, and the same goes for Halric and the other patients in the inn at Journey's Head. Is this rational? No. It would be like if you had someone who is a vegetable and you kept them alive artificially in machines, even though they aren't really there anymore. But once again, that's just who Alisaie is. She deeply cares for people like these who are so downtrodden and cannot defend themselves. She wants to help them at all costs, even if others have given up on them, because who else would then be there for them? It's basically saying that if no one else will be willing to support these people, then I will, damn it. I also want to mention that her mindset of wanting to save people comes from her wanting to push back against the depressing environment she is in. See, in Amareng, euthanasia isn't just offered, it's enforced. When the caretakers in the inn at Journey's Head suspect a person is about to turn, they will commit a mercy killing. A preferable method is by poisoning their food. At one point, Alisaie states she has seen many of those last meals. Just try to picture having to go through that over and over. No wonder she wanted to save Halric so bad. In short, Alisaie's compassion comes more in the form of this unconditional, almost maternal type of love, but it mainly manifests when she sees people who were truly wronged, that they didn't deserve the terrible state they were in, especially considering that both these examples I gave, Gabu and Halric, are children. It's basically loving something that is pure and innocent. Just to further drive home this point, yes, I know I'm being about as subtle as a hammer right now, but I just really want to go over this best as I can, because it's such an important theme with the two characters. Let's take a few moments in the story and swap the roles of the twins by putting Alisaie in charge of the Ilmore situation and Alphinaud in charge of the situation with the afflicted in Amareng. So let's say that Alisaie had planned for months or however long to enter Ilmore to learn more about it. She was daily grinding her reputation with the Ondo until finally, after a lot of effort, she is able to get these incredibly rare gems, and she has formulated a plan by which she can slip into Ilmore, awaiting the perfect opportunity. Then in comes this bloke who steals the gems because he wants to get inside Ilmore because he's hungry and wants to follow his friends. There is no chance in hell that Alisaie would give him her plan and let him use her hard work to enter Ilmore, especially considering that their mission is on the line here, especially considering that they are trying to save the warrior of the goddamn light themselves. Yeah, no, she would pretty much tell Kai Shear to fuck off and make him give her the gems back, and that boy would be lucky to walk out of that situation without getting burned verbally and or literally by Alisaie. Likewise, after liberating Ilmore, she would never try to persuade or help out these people if not pushed to do it. And so we would end up with a Kai Shear who probably died to starvation and an Ilmore that is in shambles, and the party will probably never reach Mount Gulk to fight Watery. On the flip side, Alphinaud, while he would find Halric's state to be sad, would never stick around and show enough love to push for a solution to cure him. Sure, he would pity him, but would he really be the one to push for a solution? Then we would end up with a dead Halric, and we would have never gotten the cure for tempering. So yes, in this example, I am putting both characters in a negative light, but that's exactly what I meant to highlight. What we see these two develop into is a relationship where both characters can lean on each other, each cancelling out the negatives of the other. It is having two sides of the same coin, let's call it the Louisua coin. The fact that we can look into it as deeply as examining the way in which they portray their compassion towards other people, and we still see this yin-yang thing in full display, shows how deeply rooted the writers have planted this theme in both of these characters. As in, it's not just the surface level stuff, though of course we do see this in their actual character designs. We see this in how they fight, with how Alphinaud is a healer and more methodical, while Alisaie is a red mage that leaps into action and fires up the limit break on the first possible turn. We see it in their primary character traits, with how Alphinaud is a diplomat, while Alisaie is more of a woman of action, with how their comedy is expressed, where Alphinaud is oblivious or goofy, while Alisaie is either being sassy or fangirling the warrior of light, much to her embarrassment. But the point I want to bring up with this segment is that, if you look deeper into it, you might see this yin-yang manifest itself even beyond what is on the surface, which I think shows the amazing job they did at writing these characters. And sure, it's a classic, where you got twins that demonstrate two polarities, but the thing that I'm giving props for is not necessarily for doing something original, rather I am giving props for how well they executed it, and how likable they made these characters. Also, the thing I talked about with their showing their compassion differently, I am not setting that up as an absolute, and indeed, we do see them each deviate from it slightly at times. I did mean it more that those are their core ways of showing it, which brings me to my next topic. Let's talk about overlap between Alphinaud and Alisaie. For example, let's consider how Alisaie is more emotional and more hard by contrast to Alphinaud, who is more intellect. I do think the way she delivers her thoughts has much more emotion and oomph behind them than Alphinaud, but I think that's more to show her no-nonsense attitude, in that she just expresses them much more naturally and without a filter, as opposed to Alphino, who tries to remain more collected. As I just spent some time discussing excessively, despite both of them being incredibly smart individuals, they are nonetheless emotionally driven, very much so, and express their compassion towards others in different ways. Alphino too acts in ways that many of us could view as being irrational because of this fact. So while I can see that at a first glance, Alphino might be seen as the clever, more logical thinking one, and Alisaie as the more emotional and impulsive one, I think once you see more of their story and get to know them better, you find out that there is actually a lot of overlap there, and that both of them are quite capable of making irrational decisions based on emotion, as well as rational decisions based on logical deduction. And as I wanted to demonstrate in my example where I switched their roles in Shadowbringers, the situations where they act in those certain ways is perfectly complementing each other. Though please keep in mind that I am not saying that you can't apply these as their main characteristics. You very much can, and I myself am about to do so in a moment. I just wanted to say that there is a bit more to it, that there is some overlap. In Shadowbringers in particular, this aspect is brought up to the forefront on a few occasions. Just before the solo instance where you fight the Sin Eater Onslaught in Lakeland, Alisaie comments on how Alphino is opting to act first and speak later, emphasizing how urgent the situation is, but also how Alphino is taking notes from Alisaie's book. In 4.5, Alisaie is able to fill Alphino's shoes by providing solid negotiation skills during the parley. I like this a lot because it shows they're not simple caricatures, rather they actually rub off on each other and are able to adapt. Their core qualities do not change, but sometimes they are able to improvise and think how the other one would in that situation. I would put it like this: if we talk about being diplomatic, for example, that is obviously a defining character feature for Alphino, and let's say he can do it at 100%, but Alisaie can still do it, just less efficiently at, say, 60%, and vice versa for features of Alisaie. I also love how this development can be seen in the art itself. When you take a look at the concept art for Alisaie and Alphino, what you see is a slow shift. In the Realm-Reborn interpretation of them, you see Alphino being the more dominant character in the picture, which is meant to indicate both his drive to act as an older brother to Alisaie, but also in how much of the focus was on Alphino back then. Then, in Stormblood's concept art, it's basically in reverse, where the focus is more on Alisaie and she appears much more resolved, indicating how Stormblood dedicated more screen time and development for Alisaie. Then we get to the concept art for Shadowbringers, and what we see is the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder, where neither of them are dominant in the picture, and it's a perfect balance, indicating how, by this point, the two can rely on each other equally. I am a huge fan of this part of their characters because it shows that their qualities and character traits rub off on each other, because of course they would. They intimately care for each other and have been through a ton together. It shows that even though they are different, they are also very much alike, even if they themselves would never admit it, which the Louisoix side story even mentions, funnily enough. They are two sides of the same coin. There are so many incredible scenes featuring Alisaie from Endwalker, but I will only talk about the two that left the most profound impact on me, and they were also the ones I felt were the most influential on the character. So for this first scene, I must apologize in advance, but I must really play out the entire scene because I think it's one of the best scenes from the entire game. I hope you can appreciate rewatching it in full, but if you wanna skip it, I'll give a timestamp on screen.
It's no use. Believe me, I do not enjoy being here any more than you. But she wanted us to play along, so that is what we will do.
so cold.
Painfully so. Unbearably.
I've been thinking about what Quintus said. About why no one would accept Garlean rule. Irreconcilable differences. When coexistence isn't an option, only conquest remains. Varys at Gimlet said much the same. Only by uniting the world beneath a single standard would we rid ourselves of the Ascians. United as one people, one race cleansed of imperfections. A cold and unforgiving vision. And when we fail to live up to their standards, what place is there for us in their world? But the truly sad, truly frustrating thing is how damnably similar it all is to the lofty ideals of Father and the Forum. Non-intervention. Always non-intervention. Protect our knowledge and our people, and to hells with the rest of you. And yet, I can see how it happened. Varys and Father looked to their elders for guidance and took their virtues as their own. But for this world was of their making. In who else could they place their trust? All of us lost in a sea of chaos, searching desperately for purpose and meaning. But it shouldn't just be an extension of another's. It has to be ours. It has to be. We all have a stake in this world. No one should be silenced.
I won't deny that we lack the experience of people such as Father or Quintus. Perhaps they've come to see the world as a series of problems, and the most efficient way of solving them, to reduce everything to fundamental forms. A stone is a stone, a cloud, a flower, no more than that. Simple descriptions that strip the subject of distinguishing characteristics. A man is a man, divided according to race, creed, or allegiance, and to some, defined by such associations.
Is that what you think?
In my misbegotten youth. But what I believed wisdom was no more than aggressive ignorance. I've since learned to look beyond the banners and the politics, to see people as individuals with their own hopes and dreams. As for my dream of building a better world, well, every day I'm reminded that it is far more complex than I had ever imagined. But it only spurs me onward, to find the wisdom and the strength to see it through to the very end.
So in the end, not even Father's expertly worded rhetoric could deter you from your chosen course.
Huh?
Not that I thought for a moment that it would. I've no love for violence, of course, but ours is a cause worth fighting for. I just wish he'd realize it too. Sometimes the only way to protect the ones you love is to take a stand, to refuse to suffer in silence. I want you to know I share your conviction. Whether it be on the battlefield or in the debating chamber, I won't back down. I guess what I'm saying is...
You've found your own reason to fight.
Yes. Yes, I have. God's willing, there will come a day when we can finally lay down our arms, and there will be peace. But not until the Telophoroi have been defeated once and for all. And you, brother, will have a vital part to play. By your words and deeds, you'll lead the way.
I pray I am up to the task.
There'll always be naysayers. Those who think us fools for even trying. It's easy for learned elites to criticize earnest efforts and assert their moral superiority, all without offering alternatives. Not that their sophistry has ever wounded you. So stubborn and strong. Stronger than you even know. Don't ever change, you hear me? If you stumble, I'll be there to catch you. Or give you a thick ear. Maybe both, for good measure.
Thank you, Alisaie.
Last time I spoke of this scene was from the perspective of Alphino, the way he talks about the dangers of intellectuals relying on abstractions exclusively. There is another side of this scene, which is of course Alisaie's side, who also happens to describe another type of a danger in society. She talks about how the older generation refuses to view things from the perspective of the newer generation, because that's how things worked in their time for their elders, so that has to be the correct way. Then asserting their moral superiority without offering any alternatives, all the while looking down on the younger generation. This generational gap is of course something that very much exists in the real world, and indeed isn't something that magically popped into existence in regards to boomers hating on millennials, but rather it's something that has been around for thousands of years. I also want to mention that the way both Alphino and Alisaie criticize intellectuals like Fortuno and Varys, as well as both of them aspiring to build a better world, does give off these vibes of youth empowerment. Of course, we don't know whether that was intentional or not, but it's nonetheless a nice message to be had. Do not let your earnest efforts go to waste just because of learned elites trying to put you down. I also love how in this scene, we see Alisaie sharing her brother's conviction of building a better world, but doing it in her own way. The way she says it shouldn't just be an extension of another's is a perfect full circle of her character arc, where she started off as someone who was simply mimicking her grandfather's aspirations and purpose and is someone who is now fully in control of her own life. But the most wholesome part of this scene has to be the bit at the end, where Alisaie, for the first time, acknowledges her brother's merits and assures him that she will support him no matter what, and Alphino thanks her in return. It's a very touching moment because it's the first time that the twins truly acknowledge each other's growth and how strong they have become, and each of them realize that just as they were looking out for the other, so too was the other looking out for them. It's a very beautiful representation of the sheer power of a bond that exists only between siblings. The other scene I wanted to talk about was the one after the level 88 solo instance in Garlemald mode, where Alisaie calls out Xenos. This is an interesting interaction precisely because of the similarities between these two characters, the most profound of course being their connection to the warrior flight and how that rivalry relationship gives both of them internal strength. I mentioned that the end of Coils was really where Alisaie's fangirling of the warrior flight began, but it was truly emphasized in both Stormblood and Shadowbringers. When Tesleen describes just how much she admires you and strives to do as well as you realize that it isn't just some cute fangirly thing that Alisaie has going on for the warrior flight, but it's something that truly shapes her as a person and acts in great part as her underlying drive to commit to doing greatness. Another time we see just how much Alisaie is attached to the warrior flight is when Reen suggests that the warrior flight stays in the Crystarium and they would find a cure for their current predicament, and Alisaie then kinda blows up on her. In that moment, she was deeply concerned for the warrior flight, and when Reen was making bad promises she couldn't keep, she gets quite upset.
How can you make promises? We don't even know where to start.
Alisaie, please. You know Reen was only trying to help.
Of course I know! I know only too well! But making promises you have no way of keeping is not a kindness. It's a lie. Plain and simple. We've all searched high and low for an answer, and every one of us came back empty-handed. I am not about to stand in his way now. Not after failing him in his hour of need. No! The least we can do is...
In this sense, they both have a unique trait of wanting to surpass the warrior flight that gives them strength and shapes them up as people. So it of course makes sense that Alisaie is able to see a semblance of reasoning behind the man that is Zenos, someone who most people struggle to understand. So that's why she's reminding Zenos that there needs to be some sort of a connection. He can't just go around chasing after his selfish desires if there isn't some form of a two-way relationship, or he will end up in solitude forever. I want to comment on this notion of being left alone. I think this is great because it not only reflects on Alisaie's growth because of how she used to be in the Coils story, but it's also often emphasized within the FF14 story as a common theme that has run throughout it. Bahamut in A Realm Reborn, Nidhogg in Heavensward, Artbert and Emet-Selch in Shadowbringers, and Vena in Endwalker. But I think Artbert summarizes it really well here.
But the worst thing was the solitude. Time wears you down, aye. But solitude eats away at you. It was this close to finishing me off. But as bad as it got, and as empty as I felt, I can't even begin to imagine what it must be like for Emet-Selch. All of which is a long way of saying, don't make a choice that leaves you alone. Nothing is worth that, especially not eternity.
I like how this makes it really effective, especially on us, the audience. We really understand through these past characters and their stories that the thought of having to live in solitude for an eternity is genuinely terrifying. And so it is for Zenos, and why we understand that when Alisaie says he would be alone for all eternity, that is something to truly be afraid of. So, finishing up the video here, it's interesting that the people I've spoken to over the years, there's almost an exact 50-50 split between people that prefer Alphinaud versus those that prefer Alisaie, which is something that shows how well made these two characters are, since there isn't an overwhelming majority preferring one over the other. The quality of writing exists on both characters and both got fleshed out, developed, and get an equal amount of screen time. It then really comes down to your own preference. But I also want to mention that, even though it's natural to have your own preferences, the greatness of one of the characters is reliant on the other. As in, each of the twins work precisely because there is the other to complement them. You truly can't have one without the other, and I think that's a big part of the appeal for these two. Two characters that, when combined in the same story, come out as something way more than the sum of their parts. Also, it was really wholesome how the English voice actors of these two, Colin Ryan and Beth Endwalker, met in person after 6 years of working on the game. Overall, the Leveler twins were a fantastic addition to the cast and contributed greatly to making the Hydaelyn/Zodiac story the great story that it was. Well, that's been my thoughts on Alisaie. Look forward to more of these types of analysis in the future, or with subbing is an easy way to do so. Have a nice day.